about her work as a speech-language pathologist. Julie has worked as a speech pathologist for 15 years. Speech pathologists work in a variety of settings, such as birth to 3 programs, schools, hospitals, care facilities, as well as in private practice. Tonight, Julie will talk about different types of speech-language hearing. Tonight, Julie will talk about different types of communication difficulties. The American Speech-Language Hearing Association, of which she is a member, recognizes May as Better Speech and Language Month. Julie will be presenting her speech called Recognizing Communication Disorders. Help me welcome Julie.
Good evening, fellow Toastmasters. Our culture admires one skill above all others. We are all here this evening to improve this skill in ourselves and also to watch other people improve this skill. What I'm talking about is the ability to communicate effectively, the ability to use words and express yourself using language. Imagine for a moment that you are someone who has a communication disorder and you are unable to communicate effectively. Every day in your daily life, you struggle to express yourself. People with communication disorders are very unlikely to come to one of our sessions because it would cause a lot of stress to them. So today what I'd like to do is talk to you about several different types of communication disorders, and then at the end let you know of some things that you can do to help people who are struggling to communicate. I'm a speech and language pathologist, and right now I'm working with kids age 11 to 16, but I work with younger kids, and speech pathologists can work all the way up with seniors as well. I'm going to talk about 5 different types of communication disorders. The first one is voice disorders. Voice disorders are problems phonating, so people cannot phonate to produce voice, and that of course is needed for speech. Another problem is hearing disabilities. A lot of people can be fitted with hearing aids and learn how to use them effectively, and so they don't find hearing loss to be a disability. But I do work with a lot of students who have a hard time learning how to use language and also just speaking in a way that's intelligible. A third area that's very common is articulation disorders, and that's the difficulty producing certain speech sounds. So when I work with little kids, they're really fun to work with because they're really hard to understand sometimes. Maybe they have 10 error sounds. But by the time I work with them, when kids are 11 to 16, they usually only have 1 or 2 sounds left, and that would be generally the R sound or the S sound. And then a lot of kids and a lot of people in general have a hard time pronouncing multisyllabic words. Just incidentally, I wanted to mention my most interesting phoneme that I worked on that a child had a hard time articulating was an S sound, and he substituted a nasal fricative, so that sounds like this. It's really hard to do that. So he would say that every time there was an S in a word, he would say sun. It's actually really hard to do, but that was a fun one to work on. So another area that I work on frequently with students is the area of fluency, and you're familiar with this. This is when people have a hard time speaking in a manner that flows. Stuttering is the most common of these disorders. I found that most people have a genuine interest in stuttering and want me to talk about it and what causes it and what can be done about it. And that's a whole other speech, but I will present that someday. This is an interesting topic. And the last one I'm going to talk to you about today are language disorders. Language disorders can be something like a language delay, where young kids just don't start speaking on time, or it can be a language problem where somebody has average intelligence, but their ability to use language effectively is less than that, so it's just a particular skill area that's a deficit area. And then there's people also who suffer from traumatic brain injury or strokes, that sort of thing, and lose their ability to use language. Language comes in, I work in 3 different areas with language. One area is receptive language. Right now, all of you are showing that you're using very good receptive language skill. You're listening to me, understanding what I'm saying. Hopefully, I'm able to articulate my thoughts well. Expressive language is the other language area, and that's the ability to express yourself. It's actually, a lot goes into it when you're expressing yourself. You have to select a certain type of vocabulary. You have to order your words properly in a sentence. You have to use grammar correctly. And then on top of that, you have to sequence all your sentences in order so that it's logical or at least coherent. So there's a lot of things that we do to use expressive language. The skill that we're working here in Toastmasters, both expressive and receptive language skills, we focus on every Monday. And one other area that's really fascinating is the area of pragmatic language use, and that's the use of social language. So people that I work with who have problems with this are usually on the autism spectrum. And some people have a type of learning disability that affects their ability to partake in conversations. Kids that I work with, sometimes they don't know how to enter a conversation, they don't know how to start a conversation, they have a hard time volleying back and forth, either my turn, your turn, my turn, your turn, and they don't know how to maintain conversations with comments and questions. Some of my students will just sit there and look at you. They're actually listening, but they just don't know what to do to show they're listening, and they don't know what a communication turn is. I really enjoy working with students like that. I just want to say one story. A student of mine one time was working on eye contact, which seems easy enough that you teach somebody, or you need to look at people when you're speaking. And he would look at somebody, and then he'd turn his head, and then he'd look at somebody else and turn his head. So he didn't really know how to use his head and his eyes together, so it looked really strange. So he had to spend a little more time on that particular skill of eye contact. So what can you do if you notice that you're communicating with somebody and that person is having a difficult time? I'm going to tell you 2 things that you can do. One thing that you can do is slow your rate of speech. Slow your rate of speech and also speak very distinctly. Pronounce the sounds that are in a word and maybe separate your words a little bit. Using this type of clear speech helps people who have a hard time understanding language because it helps them process language because it's a little bit slower. But it also helps people who have a hard time expressing themselves because you're allowing them to have sort of a safer speaking environment. You're giving them more time to be able to get their thoughts together. Another area that you can do is maintain eye contact with people. If somebody's really struggling to communicate, make sure that you continue to look at that person in a respectful way while they formulate their ideas. So we here at Toastmasters we work often on being good listeners, and when people have a hard time communicating effectively, it's the opposite of those people who are silver-tongued. We often think of those people as perhaps less intelligent. We think people who have communication difficulties, people who don't express themselves well, perhaps our culture views them as less competent than others. So as Toastmasters, you can help, you can be an advocate for these people you notice having problems communicating, by slowing down your rate and just doing something simple like truly listening. It's really going to help out a lot of people if you just stop and take some time and say, yes, I'm listening. Thanks.